It has been a year full of challenges in Latin America, but also one full of hope, renewal, and resilience, as well as offbeat stories and triumphs. To see why, join me for this brief look at the highlights of 2024 in Latin America. One of the year's themes in the region was the increasing threat from organized crime that Latin American governments have faced. This trend began early in the year in Ecuador, when on January 7th, José Adolfo Macías Villamar, the leader of Los Choneros, a local gang, escaped from prison. This was followed 2 days later by another jail breakout, this time of Fabricio Colón Pico, the leader of yet another gang, Los Lobos. In response, Daniel Noboa, Ecuador's president, declared a state of emergency for 60 days. This in turn led to gangs rioting in prison and a number of attacks against civilians, including multiple hospitals, a commercial center, and most famously the takeover of a Guayaquil TV station during a live newscast. The conflict continued throughout the year, resulting in the death of at least 50 people, including the assassinations of several politicians like Diana Carnero, city councilor of El Naranjal, and 2 mayors, Brigitte Garcia and José Sánchez, authorities in San Vicente and Camilo Ponce Enriquez respectively. In response, the government not only extended the emergency measures, but also held a constitutional amendment that allowed the military to be involved in combating crime. It was electorally approved on April 21st. Something similar occurred in March 2nd and 3rd in Haiti. That's when armed gangs stormed the 2 largest prisons in the country and allowed 4,700 inmates to escape. The Haitian government declared a state of emergency and a night curfew to try to gain control of the situation, but mostly failed. In the next few days, Port-au-Prince's International Airport, the headquarters of the Institute of Social Welfare, and the National Palace were attacked, while the Interior Ministry was burnt down. This prevented Ariel Henry, the Prime Minister and government caretaker, from returning to the country, which he had left to try to secure a peacekeeping force of Kenyan police to fight the gangs. Under pressure, on March 11th, he agreed to resign and let a transitional presidential council become the government, which was finalized on April 24th. In Mexico, things began a little different. The spark occurred on July 25th, when Mayo Zambada, a longtime leader of the Sinaloa cartel, who had never been captured, was tricked into flying into American territory where he was arrested. This prompted the cartel's competing factions to go to war with each other, which shut down Culiacán and several surrounding towns. Although the Mexican government sent additional security forces to deal with the problem, the conflict continues to this day with ebbs and flows and the killing of at least 120 people. Elsewhere, the country has also suffered the assassinations of multiple politicians at the hands of other regional cartels, including Gisela Gaitán, the Morena candidate for the mayorship of Celaya, Guanajuato, on April 1st, and Alejandro Arcos, the mayor of Chilpancingo in Guerrero, on October 6th. Arcos had taken office only 5 days earlier. Probably the single organized crime attack in Mexico that got the most international press, however, was the use of car bombs in 2 distinct towns in Guanajuato, Querétaro and Acámbaro, on October 25th. The latter was placed in front of a police station and had a handful of victims, while the second only had material damage. This year did see some success against criminals. On March 8th, former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernández was convicted of drug trafficking charges in New York. A few months later, he would be sentenced to 45 years in prison. In September, Colombians gunned down 2 Clan del Golfo leaders, Robinson Oquendo Guisao and alias Zeus, on September 3rd and 29th respectively. And in Brazil, on October 31st, courts convicted 2 former ex-cops to several decades in prison for the 2018 assassination of Marielle Franco, an activist and city councilor from Rio that received international attention. Insecurity did not have as many political repercussions elsewhere in the region, although on September 26th, it did see major protests in Lima, Peru, from bus drivers tired of being victims of extortions and afraid of losing their lives if they refused to pay, as many already have. Other protests in Latin America were much more directly related to government policies. In Argentina, there were several protests and strikes against President Milei's policies starting in January with union workers, on April 23rd with students upset at budget cuts in education, and on May 9th, unions followed with their own general strike also aimed at preventing budget cuts. Paraguay had something similar in April, with students marching to ensure university education remained free in the country. And in Mexico on September 10th, there were national protests against a proposed judicial reform to make all the judges in the country elected officials. The other region's theme for 2024 were the many electoral processes that took place. some ushering hope and some despair. The year began on a sanguine note in Guatemala, where on January 15th Bernardo Arévalo was inaugurated as president. He had won the presidency in August 2023, but had faced constant legal challenges, and at several points it looked doubtful he might be able to take office. Massive protests supporting his election ensured the popular will was respected, and people had hope in Arévalo's government. Unfortunately, his government has been generally too slow to act, and his approval rating as of early fall was only slightly above 50%. Meanwhile, right next door, on February 4th, Nayib Bukele was re-elected with 80% of the vote. This was despite a plain constitutional prohibition against re-election, which the courts nonetheless declared null. This is largely because of Bukele's popularity, which is the highest in the Western Hemisphere. Also in Central America, on May 5th, Panama voted for José Raúl Molino, a conservative who was able to win in part because the other right-wing option, Ricardo Martinelli, a former president who was running again, was prevented from doing so because he was sentenced to prison for embezzlement and money laundering. That same month, on the 19th, the Dominican Republic handed a re-election victory to Luis Abinader, who crushed his nearest opponent, former President Leonel Fernández, by nearly 30 points. As of today, Abinader remains the second most popular president in the hemisphere. Next came Mexico. On June 2nd, the country opted to elevate the first woman to its highest post, Claudia Sheinbaum, a protege of the previous president López Obrador, and gave her resounding majorities in both chambers of Congress, paving the way for whatever Sheinbaum's party, Morena, envisioned as Mexico's future. Puerto Rico also voted for its governor on November 5th, selecting Jennifer González Colón, the first woman to hold the post. Interestingly, alongside this vote, the island was also asked about its future status. Faced with the choice of statehood, independence, or the status quo, 57% of Boricuas opted for statehood, while only 31% chose independence, and even fewer, 12%, thought the status quo was a good idea. Although non-binding, this is the clearest sign Puerto Ricans have given that they would like to become a state and could pave the way for future change in their status. The last election of the year, meanwhile, took place in Uruguay, where on November 24th, the left-winger Yamandu Orsi defeated the conservative Álvaro Delgado, returning the Broad Front, a party that had dominated Uruguayan politics between 2005 and 2020, to power. The most important election for the region, however, took place in Venezuela on July 28th. The country had become increasingly authoritarian in the past 10 years, had suffered constant economic turmoil, massive inflation, and an almost complete degradation in government services. The opposition then sold the 2024 contest as one last final chance to rescue the country and place Venezuela in a more prosperous path. And it worked. Or it did at the ballot box, where opinion polls as well as precinct-level tally sheets published by the opposition showed that the opposition's candidate, Edmundo González, won the election by nearly 40 points. Venezuela's electoral authority declared Maduro the winner, however, and refused to show any precinct-level proof to back its claims, arguing that the results had been hacked by some foreign actor. Instead, they claimed this was an attempted coup and illegal to publish the electoral results, as the government was the only one with the authority to do so. There were massive protests in response, and a government crackdown that resulted in the killing of at least 25 people by August 15th. On August 26th, González received a court summons to respond to those charges. Fearing for his life, he opted to hide, and then on September 8th, he fled for Spain. This effectively killed any hope of a negotiated transition, as political pressure from the international community and internal dissent became much more tolerable for the regime. Thus, Venezuela is considered by the vast majority of countries a consolidated dictatorship. Unfortunately for Latin America, this year had plenty of natural disasters as well as man-made tragedies. There were multiple earthquakes. Brazil had its highest ever recorded case on January 20th, when a 6.6 tremor hit the Amazon, although fortunately with no victims. There were 2 7 or higher earthquakes on the Richter scale in the region, in Arequipa, Peru, and Antofagasta, Chile, on June 28th and July 18th respectively. Fortunately, there were only a handful of victims, but the economic cost was considerable. There was also a wildfire that destroyed much of Viña del Mar's botanical garden on February 2nd. In addition, there were multiple hurricanes, although the region was left relatively unscathed. There was, for example, Hurricane Beryl on June 28, 2024, the earliest Category 5 hurricane ever recorded, and Hurricane John on September 22nd, a particularly inconvenient one because it hit Guerrero in Mexico, which was already reeling from previous devastation. There was also terrible floods in Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil from April 29 through May, with 181 confirmed victims. In Chalco, Mexico in August, rain overwhelmed the local river and devastated the drainage system, flooding the town with rain mixed with sewage for weeks. The incompetent response from the government only made things worse. That same month, one of the worst accidents in Brazilian aviation history occurred when on August 9th, a Vopaz flight crashed near Vinhedo, São Paulo, killing all 62 people on board. In the meantime, the worst man-made disaster this year probably took place in Cuba, with nationwide blackouts that exacerbated the economic crisis already hitting the country. The blackouts began in February but were much worse in October when the country came to nearly a complete standstill. Meanwhile, there were a number of pretty bizarre stories this year. On April 5th, Ecuadorian police raided the Mexican embassy in Quito, a clear violation of international law, so they could apprehend Jorge Glass, a former vice president convicted of several corruption charges who had asked the Mexicans for political asylum. This led to the breaking of relations between the two countries and are now carrying out official business between themselves through Switzerland's diplomatic corps. On June 26, there was an attempted coup in Bolivia, led by General Juan José Zúñiga, who Luis Arce, the current president, stared down and seemingly single-handedly stopped. What is truly outlandish, however, is that General Zúñiga later claimed that this was all staged for Arce's benefit, a way to outmaneuver his rival, former President Evo Morales, for the leadership of MAS, the main party in the country. It is not clear how true this is, but what is certain is that the conflict between the two leaders is very, very real. On October 4th, Evo Morales was accused of raping a minor by Arce's government, which the former president claimed was baseless. And on November 1st, his supporters took over 3 military garrisons in Chapare, in the department of Cochabamba, and promptly demanded the case be thrown out and be allowed to run again for president. 7 days later, the country's constitutional tribunal barred Morales from running again. Meanwhile, people in Brazil had to do without X, formerly known as Twitter, for a little over a month in 2024 because on August 30th, Alexandre de Moraes, a Supreme Court judge, banned the platform because Elon Musk refused to appoint a legal representative in the country. The ban was lifted on October 8th when Musk agreed to pay a fine and complied with the orders to deactivate a number of right-wing accounts. The region also has some feel-good stories. On January 11th, archaeologists found remnants of dense cities in the Ecuadorian Amazon, a huge discovery that appends much of what we know of that area of the world. On September 20th, a pilotless electrical aerial vehicle became the first flying taxi to be deployed in the region when it took off from Quadras, Brazil, near Sao Paulo. And in sports, on February 25th, Brazil won yet another FIFA Beach Soccer title when it beat Italy 6-4. This was its 6th title, the highest number in the world. Likewise, on June 15th, Atlético Bucaramanga, a Colombian soccer club founded 75 years ago, which had never won a title and which had been on the verge of relegation a few years ago, finally won when they beat Independiente Santa Fe in penalty kicks. In the meantime, in the most important regional sporting competition for national clubs, the Copa Libertadores, Botafogo beat Atlético Mineiro, also a first for them. Finally, in the most watched sporting event of 2024, the Paris Summer Olympics, on July 31st, Adriana Ruano won the first ever Olympic gold medal for Guatemala in the trap competition for women's shooting. The Guatemalans also won bronze in the men's trap, thus doubling their entire previous Olympic medal achievements in Paris. The most successful country overall this summer, however, was Brazil, who ended up with 20 total medals, 3 of them gold, far above Cuba, who was the second Latin American country with the most medals, with 9 overall, 2 of them gold. The Dominican Republic only achieved 1 gold medal, but the person that won it, Marilady Paulino, became the first Dominican woman to do so, the 3rd person ever. Elsewhere last summer, on July 14th, Argentina won its 16th Copa America when it beat Colombia 1-0 in extra time. 2024 also saw a number of prominent Latin Americans leave the scene. Perhaps the most tragic one was Sebastián Piñera, a former Chilean president, who on February 6th died in a helicopter accident while on vacation. There were also other prominent politicians, including Alberto Fujimori, September 11th, and Piedad Córdoba, January 20th. There were sports figures, Mario Zagallo, January 5th, Luis Menotti, May 5th, and Fernando Valenzuela, October 22nd. Actresses and writers, like José Agustín on January 16th, Silvia Pinal on November 28th, and Sandra Reyes, December 1st. The death that got the most attention worldwide, however, was not one of a Latin American, but that of Liam Payne, a former member of One Direction who died on October 16th in Buenos Aires in bizarre circumstances. And finally, the death that says the most about where Latin America is right now was not that of a person but of a political party. The PRD, or Revolutionary Democratic Party, a once prominent opposition party in Mexico, was not able to muster the 3% necessary to retain its registration and met on a ceremonious end on August 27th. And with that, we will say goodbye to 2024. May Latin America and all of us bring a prosperous 2025.